My name is Denard. I'm one of the group facilitators here as well, but I just really want to introduce Bella, and then Bella shares her thoughts, and then we'll do the Q&A. I'll be in the chat if you all need me. But Bella, a mental health professional, and I hate to say this, a Texas spirit. She has the Texan in her, but I definitely know that she was traveling to Florida at one point in time. So you have
Mhm.
family in Florida, right?
I do. I do. My
Okay,
mom's
okay,
family is from Florida, so we go up there probably once a year. So I'm
okay.
there. I got
Yeah,
a
we'll
little bit
let
of
you slide.
Florida in me. Okay, okay.
We'll let you slide. But the thing that I really love about Bella, you all, is that she's not afraid to dive into the complexities of trauma, right? Some of us kind of, and if you're like me, that word I avoided because it reminded me too much of my childhood. And with that being said, she's also armed with 7 years of experience of supporting children, teens, and adults, especially those that are neurodivergent or neurotypical alike. Bella Passion, it lies in empowering individuals. Sorry, one of my dirty diaper disciples in the background. It's in empowering individuals to reclaim their narrative, right? A proud queer Mexican American hailing from, again, I'll be more specific, Austin, saddened, but she's not just what we would term as an expert, but I would say a champion for empathy and understanding. She has multiple sessions here on the Circles app. I will be sharing those rooms afterwards here with you all. But she typically, if you haven't been in a space, I was in a space for parenting. She creates a warm space, you all, for you to be heard, validated, and encouraged. So whether you're navigating past hurts or you're curious about the neural impact, I believe Bella's your person to actually share that with you. So, without further ado, I'll just ask you all if you can. I know this is not a actual space where we get to clap and applause, but I'm stealing something one of our previous masterclass hosts used to do, Jeff, and this is a nod to him as well. But would you heart on or whatever emoji you feel that would welcome Bella to this space, and then afterwards, Bella, the floor is yours. And again, I just thank you for allowing us to share space with
Thank you so much, Jenard. It's always such a pleasure. And thank you so much for hyping me up too. You're going to send me off with
you. Hey,
a great, great vibe for today's session, for today's class. And thank you so much for your offer of posting stuff into the chat. I literally just have one image to paste into the chat, and it's just because, again, guys, like I am going to be talking about different parts of the brain. And I get that the large majority of us aren't really going to feel like, okay, yeah, the amygdala is where, Bella? And I'm like, yeah, so it's by the prefrontal cortex, but it's kind of behind. That's not going to help y'all. So that picture is in the chat now. And fingers crossed that'll help give you guys some context with what I'm talking about and as we're diving in. So thank you so much again, Denard. I really appreciate the intro. And I'm so happy to see so many of my regular members here. Thank you guys for coming out to supporting me and diving into this topic because, as Denard said, this is something that I'm deeply, deeply passionate about how we look at trauma, how we observe trauma, how we engage with individuals who have experienced trauma is something that has changed drastically in the last, let's say, even 20 years being generous in the public eye, and let's say probably close to about 80 years in the psychological field following the First World Wars and really just any wars where we had, soldiers coming home, we had medical professionals coming home, we had the people who were treating them as well, so that we really had that population to draw from to really understand trauma. And I mentioned this in my previous master class, but again, I look at trauma in a very broad scope, broader than the average person. So whenever I say the word trauma, and again, thank you so much for bringing up how you feel about trauma, Denard, that thing of like, I try and avoid that word, I think that that's what most of us do because we're trying to not put implications on people. We're trying to not say, oh, you're traumatized or you have trauma, if that's not a word that they use to describe themselves. So whenever I say trauma, we're going to hearken back to the origins of the word, which is wound. Trauma is a wound. So hopefully using that definition gives you guys, a little bit more of an understanding of where I'm coming from. Because again, it's not just soldiers coming home who have PTSD, who have had traumatic events in their lives. As I again talked about in our last masterclass on this topic, it can be people who have given birth and who have had a very, very difficult time going through the birthing process. It can be mental health professionals who have cumulative trauma, who have been listening to very sad or difficult things day in and day out, and they are now understanding that they're having the effects of someone who has had traumatic events. So that'll be my last little bit about kind of talking about previous topics. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and dive into the neurology. So for anyone new coming in again, we have that reference picture in the chat, so you guys have a little bit better of an idea of what I'm talking about and a way to visualize that. So first things first, and I know that this again might be a weird thing to wrap our heads around, but trauma and traumatic events actually change the structure and change our brain's chemistry. I'd like that to land for a second too, because again, I know that that's kind of an odd concept, right? You're like, wait, Bella, you're telling me that my brain is going to grow and shrink and alter things based on something that happened outside of my brain. And I'm like, yeah, 100%. Again, your ability to perceive reality is also going to change as a result of those increases and decreases in sizes of specific areas of the brain. That is the kind of impact that we're talking about whenever we're talking about traumatic events. We're talking about the actual size, shape, and function of your brain changing. And I bring that up, and I'm bringing it up intentionally to start us off, is because whether you are here simply to educate yourself about trauma, whether you have had a traumatic experience, or you know someone who is currently going through the healing process following a traumatic event, I hope that that gives you a little bit of peace. I hope that gives you a little bit of empathy and understanding, because we don't always talk about that. We don't always talk about we are having a fundamental change take place in our brain. So give each other a little bit of grace, and I hope that you give yourself a little bit of grace too, being armed with that knowledge. And Hope, I do see your hand. We're going to save questions for kind of following this. So, and this is probably another thing to talk about as well, is that I'll probably be talking for in and around 20 minutes or so. And then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers on this topic. So I promise I'm going to do my very best to talk succinctly. And I actually, have some dictionary definitions, so I'm not harping on about my personal philosophies on certain topics. So yes, our brain structure and our brain chemistry legitimately changes as a result of trauma. And basically what happens is that we experience a TE or a traumatic event, and at that moment, our brain has now learned that the world is dangerous. And so at that moment, what it's learning is, okay, the world is very dangerous. I have a potential for harm here. I need to learn to avoid this at all costs in the future. And again, whenever you hear me talking, it might start to sound like, wait, Bella, you're talking about like me and my brain being separate entities. And I'm like, yeah, I am. That's exactly right. Because there are some parts of our body that are reflexes. Our brain is just telling it to act, and we are not consciously deciding for it to do so. And a good example of that is a startle reflex. That's something that we have from the time that we are born. So I see a newborn baby in front of me. I'm going to snap my fingers close to its ears, and I'm going to make sure that they kind of jostle around a little bit. They're responding to that noise. If I make a very loud clap, this is going to activate the startle response where their arms are going to splay outwards. And in an adult, it would be something that they would be raising their arms up to block a potential attack. It's not the baby or you who is deciding and putting in a meaningful choice. It is just your brain doing an unintentional reflex to respond to that noise. So, kind of separate entities, but again, I will clarify that as things go on. So, if you look at the image that I've pasted into the chat, what you'll see are three highlighted areas, and that's going to be the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Those are going to be the main areas of the brain that we're going to be talking about today. And then I'm going to be finishing up with a little bit of discussion on the nervous system just to gain some context. So, starting off with the amygdala, its function, to simplify it a lot, because again, trying to be succinct, guys, I promise the ADHD isn't going to take over too much. Um, the amygdala's function, we're going to think about it as an alarm bell or a motion sensor. Its whole job is to be constantly scanning and looking for potential sources of danger. And whenever it sees it, it's going to say, ding, 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 brain, brain, we need to pay attention. Something is dangerous. And following that, what's going to happen is that it's going to signal to our sympathetic nervous system, which is simplified again to say our fight or flight. And it's going to say, flood the body with adrenaline, flood the body with cortisol. Adrenaline is what's going to give us that motion, like, a rabbit running from a wolf, to kick that body into overdrive, to get ready to run, to really activate our body, raise that heart rate, raise our breath rate, and prepare for either fighting our way out or running away from the danger. Cortisol is our stress hormone. And again, we're not going to get too much into this because we're going to be talking about that in our next class. But just know that our main things that happen when the amygdala goes is ding ding, that's our alarm bell, our amygdala, and it's signaling to the sympathetic nervous system to flood our body with adrenaline and cortisol. So, whenever we encounter trauma in our lives, our amygdala actually becomes hypersensitive. It learns, okay, we've experienced this first traumatic event. I now know, as the amygdala, I constantly need to be scanning for danger. And it's what we can also term as hypersensitivity or overreactivity. It's looking for things. It's our hypervigilance being engaged. It's sitting there and saying, I see danger around every corner. So it's lighting up all of the time, all of the time, in times whenever we don't actually want it to light up, which leads us to having disproportionate responses whenever things that it thinks might be dangerous in its, uninformed internal thought process being the amygdala versus really what's happening is we're being triggered or activated by something that isn't actually an immediate danger. But our amygdala doesn't know that. It just knows we're getting nervous, we're getting stressed, and so I'm going to fire that alarm bell to start off that sympathetic nervous system process. So once it becomes more sensitive and easier to activate, as a result, as I was kind of discussing there, survivors of trauma are less tolerant of stress. Before, you might have been able to sit through those really, really stressful family dinners, maybe fighting in your relationship, or even just arguing with your kids, which is, again, these are all very normal day-to-day experiences. But following the trauma, you're noticing that you're getting more irritable, you're becoming shorter, maybe you're more prone to aggressive outbursts, or additionally, you are, more fearful, you're more scared, you're leading into crying spells. And again, you're like, why is this happening? And it's simply because your body is trying to grapple with a new source of information. It's trying to grapple with a new reality that the world is dangerous in a way that it wasn't dangerous before. And that kind of leads us into our next area of the brain, which is our hippocampus, which is actually responsible for our emotion. Additionally, it's responsible for our learning and our memory as well. But, and again, kind of look at that image to give yourself a little bit of a reference, but the hippocampus and the amygdala are right next to each other. I want you to think about them as best friends who are talking and gabbing and gossiping all the time. The hippocampus is feeding off of the amygdala, and the amygdala is feeding off of the hippocampus. Because it's messing with our perception of our memory and our emotion, we can take that logical inference and say, oh, okay, so the amygdala is sounding that alarm bell, and then the hippocampus is being activated, and that's what's controlling our emotions. Before, I could handle stress, I could handle that alarm bell, but it wasn't activating my hippocampus to really engage that emotional response. And I hope that that's making sense. And again, guys, if it's not, I promise we will clear it up in the sections. But again, think about them as constantly talking to each other. They're informing each other of the reality of outside of the brain. The alarm bell dings in the amygdala, and then the hippocampus begins to process those emotions. And again, putting in a little bit of inference with the memory and emotion being linked in the hippocampus. Now that we have the ability to study, MRIs and CT scans, we're actually able to look at what the brain looks like whenever we encounter a flashback, particularly a flashback to a traumatic event. And it is the hippocampus that is lighting up with activity. Again, because it is responsible for that emotion and that memory. What is a PTSD flashback if not the culmination of emotion and memory? And this is why whenever that alarm bell rings, you are having that disproportionate response. Perhaps your traumatic event was linked to a woman with dark hair. Your brain has now recognized, okay, well, this woman with dark hair who is, was wearing a pink shirt and blue jeans and blue shoes. Now, every woman with dark hair and a pink shirt and blue jeans and those shoes is going to remind you and to activate that alarm bell. Even though they're probably just the person who's checking you out at the grocery store or the person who's dropping off your food delivery, they don't mean to scare you. They don't mean to activate or trigger you, but all your brain knows is That alarm bell needs to go off. And so that is going to have that cascading or waterfall effect of triggering that flashback. And sadly, again, what happens whenever we have a traumatic event is our hippocampus actually decreases in size, where the amygdala becomes hypersensitive and is constantly lighting up. Our hippocampus, whenever we have that traumatic event, that cortisol and those stress hormones flood the hippocampus and they actually kill off those cells. They kill off a portion of those cells, and that's why it decreases in size. So now, if we want to think about it as, let's say, a computer, we got that big burst of electricity and it fried certain elements of the computer. Now that computer is effectively running on half of the power that it had before. So, oh yeah, on top of trauma, on top of all of the really difficult things about trauma and living with trauma, you now have to worry about your impact of less emotional stability, less learning capabilities, and your memory being impacted. And that again is why so many people, their short term memory and sometimes their long term memory is affected by trauma. Because again, one of the roles of our hippocampus is to process moving short term memories into long term memories. And it is sometimes kind of a joke with those of us who study trauma or we're doing experiments. We see someone, we're trying to study the effects of trauma, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I totally forgot that the study was today. I totally forgot I was supposed to turn in my data. And I'm like, hey, that's kind of an answer by itself. Like, we get it. We really do. Because again, we know that it's going to affect your memory to some extent. We understand that 100%. So it can make it challenging to study sometimes, but it also confirms it in certain senses, if that makes sense. So whenever we have, again, those flashbacks, and again, to try and keep linking these all together, we have our amygdala, which is our alarm bell. We have our hippocampus, which can, again, be watered down to our emotion and our memory and our learning. And again, can also be linked to our flashback, that hippocampus decreasing in size. What has the ability to pull us out of that flashback? What pulls us out of that flashback is our perception of reality. It's why we use grounding techniques. It's why we use somatic experiencing techniques. It's trying to ground ourselves in reality, pull ourselves out of that memory, and really try to engage in that rational thought. And where that rational thought lives is our final area, which is our prefrontal cortex. So our prefrontal cortex is responsible for our higher level functioning, things like planning, decision making, critical thinking skills, problem solving, all of those higher level abilities that we have because our prefrontal cortex is larger than it is in other animals. And yes, guys, that's what we are. We're all animals. It's okay to some extent. Um, so, with that prefrontal cortex being engaged, sadly, again, following traumatic events, our prefrontal cortex actually shrinks in size. So now we have two areas of the brain that certain cells are getting killed off as a result of trauma, and they are shrinking in size after being overloaded and fried, essentially. So now, not only are we having a disproportionate emotional response that is making it difficult to control, our rational thought to pull us out of that flashback is impacted. It's making it what was already a very challenging job even harder. So, with that rational thought, again, being impacted, that makes it harder to soothe ourselves, to say, hey, logically, I know that this lady with the dark hair at the grocery store or dropping off my food delivery, logically, I see her face. I recognize that she is a different person than the person who is linked to my traumatic event. But again, because my prefrontal cortex is, decreased in size, decreased in volume, my ability for rationalizing and logicking my way out of that situation is severely impacted. And again, it's also distracted as well, because whenever we are constantly in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or our sympathetic nervous system, it's really, really difficult to be capable of rational and logical thought. If you think about, let's say there's a lion or a tiger sitting in front of you, it's being kind of held back with a rickety cage, and you're also about, let's say, 20 feet away from that cage. Your fight or flight response is going to be turned on pretty high because you're like, oh man, is that swipe going to be the one that breaks the cage? Is that swipe going to be the one that breaks the cage? Oh no, it has really big teeth too. And then Bella's standing next to you and is like, hey, so if I give you a really complex problem solving question, can you go ahead and answer that while you're being distracted by the lion or the tiger in the cage? No, you're not going to be able to do it because you're like, Bella, I have more important things to focus on, like my life right now. That's kind of, again, a simplified example of why our logical and our rational processes aren't going to be working well. So, again, to link all of those concepts together, we have our amygdala, which is our alarm bell. Following trauma, it becomes highly active, more active than we want it to, and it's alarming off at inappropriate or inopportune times. We have our hippocampus, which decreases in size, decreases in volume, and as a result of that, emotions and memory are impacted. And finally, we have our prefrontal cortex, which again decreases in size following that traumatic event, and our rationale and our logic is severely impacted. And then to work ourselves back up the ladder, because our rationale and logic is affected, it makes it harder to pull out of that flashback, which again makes it harder to turn off that alarm bell. So I hope that all of that, kind of trying to sum it up, and again, having those images makes it a little bit easier. And for those of us, again, who do have that trauma, or we know people who have trauma, you're like, Bella, are you telling me that for the rest of my life, I'm going to have a smaller than average hippocampus and prefrontal cortex? No, not at all. Because we have neuroplasticity. Because our brain was capable of changing in response to a traumatic event, that means it can also heal in response to therapeutic and medical intervention. Those areas of the brain that were severely impacted, it can regrow, new connections can be formed. That is the beautiful, beautiful thing about our brains, is that it is so flexible, it's so resilient, and the more and more that we advance neuroscience, we advance investigating this area of psychology as well, we're going to continue to be able to regenerate areas of the brain. in ways that we probably now cannot even possibly fathom. And again, as someone who focuses heavily on trauma and has trauma themselves, man, I am so, so excited to see where our brains take us, to see the people who have trauma themselves, who are motivated to study these areas, who have that real drive to help people. It is going to change the world. So I know that it might be a little bit scary, and I know that it might, knowing this information, knowing how our brain changes in response to trauma, it might be, might increase that amygdala function. It might set off that alarm bell. But to put you at ease, to put all of us at a little bit of ease, is that the damage that our brains sustain, it can be healed, it can be aided. And there's so much hope in the world because of what we know. And it's why wonderful, wonderful people like Denard, like my fellow facilitators here on Circles, like all of the wonderful people who are supporting you in your healing journeys, it is why they are so vital. It's why we can't make ourselves an island whenever we are going through these traumatic events and the healing process that follows. Is because if we avoid everything, if we have that pathological avoidance to things that remind us of our trauma or things that might lead to stress or adverse experiences, we're going to be sitting in, a soft, comfy room, yes, but we'll be sitting there by ourselves. We'll be losing out on all of the wonderful things that make the world what it is. So, my advice, my last thing to kind of send us off into our questions and answers is yes, we're capable of sustaining damage, but we are also capable of healing. And that healing is aided whenever we include other people on the journey. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your patience. And I think myself and Denard are very excited for some questions. So let's get started. And I think too, I see a lot going on in the chat.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
I
have you
I try
been
to
monitoring
post.
that, Denard?
Yeah. It's good
Okay,
things, good
okay,
things, good
okay,
things. You've activated the nerdiness in a lot of people. But
okay,
so
great.
this is what I did. At least three of the questions, Hope just reposted hers. So the last two posts are the questions that I saw thus far. Then you also have Danielle's hand. So whatever direction you want to go, feel free. I'll just be chiming in the chat to try to make sure I keep the last question there for you until we get to time.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Denard. Okay,
You're
so
welcome.
Danielle, I see your hand. Let's go for it.
Thank you. Okay, so one of like this all is making a whole lot of sense. And I feel like because I am like able to relax more often and because, you know, my my startle reflex and my emotions are more in check, it's like signs to me that like healing is happening. The one thing I still have a question about, and it's something that I noticed within myself, is like the speed at which my thoughts are coming are so much less. When I was in my traumatic experience, when I was like living in that, like my mind would not shut down. Like it wouldn't slow down or stop at all. Like it was just a constant state of thoughts. And I don't really know or understand like how is that related, because now that like I'm not in the trauma anymore and it's been a long time, well, not a long time, but I'm healing. My thoughts are a lot more like consistent and slower and they make sense. But I would think if my fight or flight was being activated, like why is also like that prefrontal cortex, I guess, just going off so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing to be aware of, and again, to kind of link those things together, Danielle, you hit the nail on the head by linking your thoughts being more active, more engaged, and more prevalent whenever you were going through that traumatic experience. Because again, you're in that state of hypervigilance and hyperarousal. Your brain is constantly sitting there thinking, okay, I need to be paying attention to my environment. I need to be paying attention to the people around me. I need to be paying attention to my career. I need to be thinking about my possible ways out of this scenario. Do I have an exit plan? Do I have people that I can lean on? You know, all of these things, your brain is going a mile a minute because, again, it knows that there is possible danger around the corner. So, whenever that brain slows down, whenever it has a second to enter that parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest, unfortunately, what happens is that our body finally gets that moment to breathe. It finally gets that peace. And then everything hits us of just how stressful that time was. Everything hits us of, oh my God, my brain was on fire for days or months or years, and I didn't feel it because I was constantly just trying to keep myself and potentially others alive. Because you know I know your story well, Danielle. And so again, we'll talk about this in the next class as well, that physical impact of trauma. But this is why we most often see people who we might have chronic illnesses, we might have chronic fatigue, we might have other medical problems like adrenal fatigue. Because again, that adrenaline is getting jacked up all the time. And so our body now is really, really struggling with that overload. People will very often go into long, long bouts of sickness following a traumatic event. And it's simply because their body is trying to heal. So it makes sense that those thoughts are a lot slower. And I know, again, knowing you and your story, that you are so deeply consistent on your healing journey. As much as is humanly possible, you are consistent. But I also know that you have other responsibilities in your life too. So that potential for really, truly sitting in that silence and that isolation and not having any stress at all, that might not be totally realistic for you because, again, I know that you have other people that you're worried about. I know that there are other people in your life that you have responsibilities to. So that's why taking that time, and again, I know we've discussed this before in rooms, but that's why taking those opportunities to say, yes, please, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever, please take over and let me just sit in a room alone by myself and drink my coffee and let me organize my thoughts. Let me journal about my experiences to engage my critical thinking skills in a healthy and safe, low impact way. That's why those activities are so important. And again, to harp on a little bit about journaling and writing and why it is so important is because it activates all of those areas of the brain. You're writing stuff down, so that's immediately engaging your prefrontal cortex. It's engaging that higher learning. But then it's also addressing your memory and your emotion and your hippocampus. You're thinking about that. You're almost reliving it in certain ways because you might be writing it and detailing it. And again, you're lowering that amygdala's response. You're letting it calm and know that you're writing, you are safe. And just because we're thinking about that very difficult event, it doesn't mean that the alarm bell needs to go off, because I'm taking the time to constructively address it. And that's kind of how we heal our oversensitive amygdala. And I hope that that makes sense. And again, I hope that that addresses your question. But if it didn't, please do correct me, and I'll try and address it better.
No, you hit the nail on the head. Thank you so much for kind of sorting that out for me. I appreciate you. And
No.
you too, Denard.
No problem at all, Danielle. And I'm really happy that that helped. So I'm going to hop over to the chat now, because I know I'm going to try and get everyone. Da, 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 da. I think Denard, you were saying it was Hope, and then I
Yeah,
see Cheryl as well. There's a couple here.
correct.
I'm
Correct.
just trying to find where the first question is to kind of organize it.
No, you're good. You're good. And I didn't organize them in the order. The first one I just posted was from Rachel, and I'm actually going to repost it here again.
Okay,
And then
awesome.
you have
Thank
a
you.
grouping of them from Cheryl.
Great.
But some of those were answered by Carly in the chat as well. But if you want to speak towards it, feel free. So Rachel's question is in regards to the CBT, is it at all helpful for our prefrontal cortex if offline? That would be the first
So,
question.
yeah, so for me, and Rachel, I saw your hand, so do you have a clarifying statement for that?
Yeah, so just to clarify, I know that we've discussed CBT before, and I have opinions on that. But again, knowing that the prefrontal cortex is an online, what is the differentiation between CBT and that trauma-focused CBT, and if that's at all efficacious?
Yeah, and thank you so much for clarifying that, Rachel, because I know that we definitely have talked about that CBT, which again, if you're not aware of that acronym, that means cognitive behavioral, oh God, why am I struggling to say that? Behavioral therapy. Guys, the Southern accent really does come through sometimes. And then I'm
Yeah.
just like, behavioral. Um, but yes, let's say CBT to clarify things. So whenever we have that as a concept, I don't always lean in to CBT whenever I'm talking to individuals who have trauma, because again, as Rachel said, if that prefrontal cortex is offline, or it's at that diminished capacity because of that lower volume, because of the impact of trauma, I need to heal that first from a neuroscience perspective. I need to orient that person to reality. I need to orient that person to the present moment and to what is a real danger and what is a perceived danger. CBT is wonderful whenever I'm starting with a baseline of a person who's like, hey, I've encountered some normal life stress. Maybe I'm having some difficulties in my career. Maybe I'm having some difficulties with my family, like, money trouble, or people are fighting, or something like that. But whenever we begin to talk to individuals who have trauma, and again, now that we have this context of how it affects the brain, we don't really look to CBT to be efficacious, again, as you said, Rachel, because they are not at this stage where CBT is going to be beneficial. And so that's why, again, I personally, whenever I start discussing, how trauma affects the brain, the people that we work with who have traumatic events, what I try to do first is find the baseline. I'm sitting with someone and I'm like, okay, do they have the rationale to pull themselves out of a flashback? Okay, so the answer is no in this scenario. And I'm like, all right, so we're dealing with the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. We need to go back, and I now need to focus on orienting their body and their mind to the current reality of things. I need to work on shaping their understanding, both logically in their brain and somatically in their body, of what is safe and what is not safe. I personally liken it to, if I were talking and, seeing someone with CBT, they've already say they've got 75% of their brain functioning, their brain power, their brain healthiness. They just need that extra 25% to reorient themselves, maybe gain a few new perspectives, gain a new tool in their toolbox, but they don't need a whole lot. Whereas that trauma person, if that has happened in childhood, if that has happened early in their youth, their brain has been hammered with pain and difficult experiences. It has been really irrevocably changed. And so we might be starting from a baseline of 0% to orient them to safety in the present moment and to pull them out of that flashback. And that's why things like somatic experiencing, like grounding and mindfulness and EMDR are so very helpful. And I think personally what I usually advise, and I know that we've kind of discussed that, is seeing a trauma specialist and seeing maybe a more traditional talk therapist or talk mental health professional to aid in the healing alongside the trauma specialist. Because the trauma specialist, those experiences are going to be very, very intense. Very, very intense. And you need a whole other person sometimes to talk about that experience with. So with the trauma specialist, you're talking about your trauma. With maybe your CBT or traditional talk therapist, you're going to be talking about the trauma therapist. You're going to be like, man, I did this experience and it brought up X, Y, and Z in me. But afterward, I was feeling like this. Can you maybe explain why I could have been feeling like this, or how I can, prepare myself following my trauma-focused situations, or my trauma-focused sessions? That is what I would personally recommend, because again, you just have more people. And if that's not feasible, because again, we have to be mindful of finances and resources, I would talk to your trauma specialist of like, hey, I live by myself. I live in a city where none of my family are, and I'm totally isolated. How do you recommend I prepare for these trauma-focused sessions? And how do you recommend I practice aftercare? Because they should be able to answer those questions. And if they don't answer those questions, then I would be a little bit concerned, because it should be something that they've thought about, and it should be something that they can at least advise you about. So to sum up, I think, again, guys, just because I know that went a little bit long, CBT can be efficacious for certain populations, but you need to have a good baseline of health for CBT to work. Otherwise, what I would suggest is finding a trauma specialist, and perhaps, if it's available, finding a traditional CBT-focused therapist to use in conjunction along with the trauma specialist. And again, if the CBT specialist isn't available, or that's too much of a financial stress, make sure that you are taking into consideration the physical and emotional toll that trauma specialist work is going to take on you, because it will take a toll. You will see very, very big improvements in a short amount of time using things like EMDR and somatic experiencing. But it's going to be in a much quicker fashion. Something that might take you 2 or 3 sessions in EMDR might take you a whole year of a year of sessions with a traditional CBT approach. And for some people, they need that slow approach. That is what is safe for them. Otherwise, that slow approach isn't going to work because right now, in this moment, they might be a suicide risk. They might be at risk for self-harm. They might be at risk for harming others because they don't understand that they are not in danger anymore. It is unfortunately why we have occurrences with soldiers coming home and having access to firearms. Again, this is not the large majority of soldiers by any stretch of the imagination, but we have those occurrences where we have that intense flashback, not understanding that we are no longer at war or we are no longer in combat. We pick up that firearm and we shoot at the enemy. But unfortunately, it wasn't an enemy. It was just that person who was dropping off your food delivery. And these people, again, it is why we have to destigmatize trauma. It's why we have to have these conversations. Because if we focused more, and I know this is a little political, I'll keep it short, but if we focused more on mental health care in this country, those situations would happen on so much of a lesser basis. People would be getting the help that they need. They would be getting the support that they need, and they would be having other individuals to speak to, and they wouldn't be so isolated. So I hope that helps. I hope that that answers your question again to the best of my ability. And you know, Rachel, you can always talk to me more about this topic. I'm just going to pop into the chat as well. So Cheryl says, Alzheimer's affects what part of the brain and how does cortisol fit in? Oh my gosh, great question, Cheryl. So Alzheimer's, again, it is again, we would call it a neurodegenerative disease, which means that it is killing off parts of the brain. And again, because we're talking about memory and we are talking about the prefrontal cortex as well, in Alzheimer's patients, their hippocampus is very, very heavily affected. They also have a very, very different perception of time than the average person. It's why whenever they have those situations of, oh, who are you again? Or where am I? It's because they might genuinely think that it is 30 years in the past. They might look at you, and instead of seeing their granddaughter, you look so similar to their daughter that they call you by your mother's name. Because again, to them, they are in a different period of their lives because their memory is being affected, particularly their short-term memory to begin, which again, dealing heavily with that hippocampus. And the prefrontal cortex is involved because we're also looking at the relationship to our critical thinking, our rationale, our logic. The degeneration isn't there quite as heavily as it is in the hippocampus, but it's still there to an effect. And eventually, the longer that Alzheimer's progresses, it will affect nearly every single area of the brain down to our motor functioning and our ability to control involuntary reflexes. It's a really, really difficult disease, but again, thankfully, we are making some really, really wonderful progress in that area. So if you have someone in your life who has Alzheimer's, I really hope that that this conversation is a little bit, a little bit helpful, a little bit comforting in certain aspects. But we are learning a lot, And I really hope that in a few years, we'll be able to significantly prolong people's lives who have Alzheimer's. Okay, so oh, and how does cortisol fit in? So again, cortisol is going to deeply affect our body's functioning. And again, I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll keep this short. But because cortisol is basically affecting our physical health, whenever our physical health is severely affected, it is very, very much so going to affect our emotional health, particularly with things like sleep. People who have Alzheimer's or dementia symptoms, sleeping is going to be that one thing, again, because that's another process of short to long-term memory, which is why their short-term memory is so affected. It's because they are not sleeping. And again, because they're not sleeping, then the symptoms get worse. And because the symptoms get worse, they're not sleeping. And it's just a very, 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 very sad cycle. So avoiding things like alcohol, avoiding things like certain substances, things that impact our sleep is the very best way to help with that side of the symptoms. Eating things that are rich in melatonin and magnesium are really going to help regulate your cycle, and making sure that you're maintaining a routine to maintain that circadian rhythm as well. Super, super important. And finally, hope. Does the neurologic pathway get damaged because of trauma? For sure it does. Would you mind clarifying, Hope? And I'm sure that there might be a few Hopes here, but whoever asked that question, would you mind clarifying what you meant? Yeah, Hope, I see your hand. Go for it.
Yes, I'm in the medical field.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I had a malignant narcissist. Thank you, Dinar, for what you did the other day. God bless you. I learned a lot with Dinar. The neurons don't regenerate. And the difference between Alzheimer's is like cancer in the brain versus a trauma. I was frustrated at the beginning because I always been very logic. You know, I'm in science, so I'm Christian too, but things need to make sense to me. Otherwise, I get frustrated. And I learned a lot in circles. I read all the books. So you're telling me that the trauma damaged the neurons in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, and in the prefrontal cortex. We have empathy in the prefrontal cortex, emotions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because I'm becoming more mellow now. I'm more mellow. Yeah, yes. The other day, when I had to finally say goodbye, I realized I was grieving the good part of my hopefully soon to be a husband. I don't miss the bad part. Then I'm grieving the loss of my dog. Then I had to recover from a severe trauma. I did fine. I went to college after my childhood. I never did drugs. I turned myself into do right from a emotional and physical abuse mother for like 6-7 years. She did it. So nothing got damaged when I was a child. And I'm an adult now, which is amazing. I'm 50 years old. You're saying that all those areas of my brain, they're being damaged with no... Because when the neuron is damaged, neurons don't regenerate, that's what is bad in some part of the body. Some places don't regenerate. You're telling me that I will never be able to practice medicine again?
Not at all. And I'm just gonna mute you so we don't have that echo. Oh, sorry, actually I can't. Denard, would you mind? Okay, thank you. Not at all, Hope. And I think, again, this is something that we have to be conscious of. And I think, again, having this this effect of neuroplasticity is so very, very, very important. And again, to give you an example and a study to research, because again, I can even hear in your voice as well that analytical mind, and I really love how you you linked that spirituality and science as well. You're like, hey, I'm a Christian, but things need to make sense to me. I really like that. So something that's very interesting and might help if you're aware is there's this study called the London taxi driver study. And so what that discusses is it talks about the actual growth of London taxi drivers in their spatial awareness, in their place cells, and their grid cells, because as part of their licensing, they have to know the City of London by memory. No Google Maps, no maps of any kind, no aid of any kind. They get in that taxi and they have to know exactly where they're going. And so, in comparison to people who are not London taxi drivers, who did not have to have that necessary skill to pass that exam, their brain volume is actually significantly and noticeably larger than the average person. And yes, for sure, whenever we lose neurons, we cannot regenerate them, but we can mend them. Whenever those connections weaken, but are not totally broken, we can increase those neural pathways and we can increase the strength of our neural pathways. And what that looks like, and again, another thing to Google is our myelin sheath. MYELIN and SHEATH, myelin sheath. Our myelin sheath is what coats the linkages between neurons. Think about it as adding bricks to a bridge to make it bigger and stronger and more robust. The more times we walk on that road, we're adding bricks to it. We're making it stronger. And so when we do an action and it is linked to another one, by that very nature, by linking those two things, we are increasing the coating of our myelin sheath. And so it actually, again, thickens, it gets bigger. And whenever we don't use those connections, when we don't use those skills like playing guitar or drawing, it weakens because we're not using it. It's where that phrase comes, use it or lose it. It's where that phrase really comes from, is because if we want those skills to work, if we want those skills to really be effective, we have to use them on a consistent basis. So I would say for you, Hope, to put it in context, you already have a huge amount of base knowledge in practicing medicine. It's already there. It would be a very different story if you were telling me, like, hey, at 50, I'm going to revamp my life. I'm going to take the MCATs and I'm going to become a doctor. I'm going to become an MD. I would be like, yo, first of all, respect. That's a huge, huge undertaking. It might be harder for you because of your adverse life experiences. So let's make sure we make accommodations in these areas. And I'm going to make sure you're aware of it. But with you, because you already have that knowledge and that good working knowledge, you're not starting from ground zero. What you have to do is work those muscles, reignite that myelin sheath to thicken and to become like that second nature again. You absolutely have the capability to practice medicine again. Absolutely. And I did see your mic come on, so I'm assuming you were responding, so please go for it.
Because I include spirituality since I was very young. when I went to pre-med school, which a sociology professor couldn't understand it. What that was his problem. I'm more holistic. So just an analogy, this is like when people lose their eyesight, they develop more sensitivity to the ear side. So you're telling me, yeah, you are going to be traumatized. Some parts are going to be a little bit affected, but other parts are going to be overgrown to compensate for this. Pretty much that's what you're saying. Because it will be sad not to be able, because I will never treat patients again if I'm not going to be safety, because I hold people in so high esteem because I see them as the spirit, mind, and body. And if you don't, I mean, they're a soul. They're a soul before any physical. I don't care what other doctors think. If you cannot work with the spirit and the soul, they'll never get better because they'll never be ready to do the right treatment. And I want to be safe. I want to be safe for them. I want to be sure that, I mean, I don't know how long it's going to take me, but it would be sad not to be able to, I don't know. I just want to be sure. I got scared. I haven't read the physiology book. I got really scared.
Yeah, I really, really, really do understand that, Hope. But I think again, you already made that wonderful, wonderful linkage of, when people lose their eyesight, yes, that those nerves are affected. That area of the brain is effectively shut down because it's not receiving input from those nerves anymore. But again, as you said, those other areas of the brain grow to compensate, and they grow hugely. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating in my opinion, because again, I love neuroscience. I love to study the brain. It is so fascinating to me to see just how strong that neuroplasticity is at work. Just how much our brains can change and grow in structure and in chemistry to compensate. And it's why we look at children and we say that they're so resilient, and to adults as well. But when we look at those children, they are so resilient because they are so adaptable. Your brain is going to adapt. And as long, again, and you, by the way, thank you for talking about your respect for the soul and for the holistic approach, and to the respect for the spirit and healing, because I completely agree with you. I call myself a holistic approach to healing because I need to treat all of it. If I only spot heal certain areas, or if I only spot help certain areas, there might be a whole underlying area that I'm missing because I'm over focusing on one thing. So thank you for being so considerate to your patients and to your colleagues, because we need more doctors and we need more medical professionals like you in the world. The people who are willing to put their ego in check and say, you know what, I am not going to practice until I know it is safe for me to do so, and I am comfortable and I am happy and I am ready to embark on that. Thank you for your consideration, because that is rare.
Thank you, Dr. Bella. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. And I think that we're a little bit up on time now, so thank you, guys, for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. Again, thank you for your patience, and for your willingness to learn and to be here. I hope it came out enough just how passionate I am about this topic. So please, if you have any further questions, please feel free to step in on any and all of my rooms, because I talk about this a lot in there. And you are more than welcome to reach out via DM if you have any more questions about this topic. And thank you again, Denard. I just popped into the chat and you were putting in links to the London taxi driver study and to myelin and why it's important. Guys, look at those links. I'll give you a few seconds, to screenshot maybe if you've not already been screenshotting, but really, really, really good information to have. And it's so, again, I can't tell you guys, all of the new faces and all of the familiar ones. It's so, so nice to see this many people here because, again, it just means that we have more educated people in the world. And my favorite thing to say is that educated people are empowered people. By being educated, you are empowering yourself, but you will also at some point empower others to be authentic, to be honest, to be vulnerable. And that is what we need when we are going on healing journeys. So thank you very much. And it has been an absolute joy. And thank you, Denard, for being such a wonderful, wonderful person to have along on this journey of this session, of this masterclass. And thank you so much for all of your help with the linkages and keeping track of questions. It was unbelievably helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bella. Bella, before you go, you whet our palate, but you didn't tell us when's the next session.
Oh, my bad.
You're good.
So our next session is going to be on the 22nd of January, and that is going to be addressing the physical impact of trauma, which is why I didn't get too much into the nervous system and medical conditions and kind of things like that, because that's what we're going to really be diving into in the next session. So I will see you all there. And yeah, guys, another one, now that we have so many people too, like, please feel free to have some questions on deck if that's something. And we'll, again, try to do about half presenting and half questions and answering too. So try and make room for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you again, Bella. And one thing I just want to highlight, as you all are just, we're going to keep this, just like Bella said, we'll keep it open for a few minutes for you to screenshot because there's a lot of things. But as we navigate the complexities of trauma, one thing that was said here, I think is very crucial to remember, that healing is possible, right? And while today's session just provided a foundation, I think, and I want to kind of re-emphasize, Bella has curated a variety of rooms, you all. And I'm talking about focusing on different stages and avenues of recovery. So let's continue this journey beyond this space, but return the next time this session happens. Have your questions on deck. I have a question on deck already, Bella. I'll send it to you as well. But I definitely want to say thank you again for being you in this space and also being a champion for not just this topic, but for humanity, because that's what I was hearing from your passion. You all, I don't have anything else to add. I just thank you for being here with us. And you see, this is too good to keep to yourself, right? So you got to share it. You just got to share it. Don't miss out. And Caitlin, you shared it in the chat. It's going to be on Spotify. Bella just learned today that it's on Spotify, right? We're going to put her out there. We're going to put you out there. But honestly, there was a lot of information. And so I would say, just like Insight Mike says, this is to digest as well. So just take your opportunity. It'll be about a few days, like 1 or 2 days, but it'll be available on YouTube and Spotify. I encourage you to go back and listen, connect. And also, the month ago, you had a session with Czar I listened to. And I would also suggest you all go to listen to the sessions you had with Czar. You thought this was an immense blessing or a delight for your soul. Just go check out the session with Czar. It's available on Spotify and YouTube. So listen, you don't have to stop here, but I'm just going to encourage you, continue on your journey and check out Bella's rooms. And please be here next time as well. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The YouTube channel is specifically. Let me look it up. But basically, if you put circle support there, James, I see it in the chat. You'll see our link, or you can just put Circles Masterclass. Let me just pull it up real quick to make sure I'm giving you the right information. Just give me 1 second, and I'll try to put it in the chat for those that are waiting for it. Yeah. Oh, I said it incorrectly. It's Circles Online Group Support. And let me see where we have our masterclass. Yeah, it's right there. Actually, Bella's literally the first one there. So I'll post a link here. I'll post a link here for you all. Just give me 1 second. Uh, all right. Now I'll give specifically the link to Bella's actually. Okay, this is trying to give me a hard time. So let me just give you the link and you'll check it out for the master classes. But I promise you it's there. Right, James, I just linked the link in the chat. But if you definitely just go and if you even type in Bella Zimmerman, trauma circle should actually have we've already tagged it. So you should actually be able to see it there as well. Yeah. And I will also put this in the support group too as a link for you all. So thank you again, and I hope that you all have a good one. I have to go run off and chow down on some food before I go put my little ones to sleep. But it was good seeing you, Kathy. Good seeing you, Kelly, Alexis. I see that you're returning into this place, so I hope that this experience has been an experience worthwhile for you. Janabel, Kona, I was giving you a shout out earlier before you came on. I kept Bella and I were waiting to see you, and you joined. You snuck in there. Lewis, Hope, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Morgan,
Of course I was gonna come in
Kenny,
here.
what happened, Kona?
Why wouldn't I come in here? Of course I was on my way.
Yeah, we know. And then I see KD. KD, I thought you were going to pose a question, but you didn't. And Baba, Tracy, James, as always, you all, thank you for staying and joining this space. I'll be closing the chat out now. Hopefully, everyone got what they needed. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.